On March 13, 1977, a California Highway Patrol officer conducting a routine patrol along the Riverside Freeway noticed something unusual on the shoulder, a large industrial trash bag that seemed oddly heavy and misshapen. When the officers stopped to remove what he assumed was illegal dumping, he made a horrific discovery. Inside the bag were the dismembered remains of a young man, carefully wrapped and packaged with an almost clinical precision. This grisly find would be one of many that would expose the work of Patrick Wayne Kaerney, a killer who had turned Southern California's vast freeway system into his personal dumping ground. For over a decade, Kaerney had been hunting, killing, and disposing of young men and boys with a methodical efficiency that had allowed him to avoid detection. His victims, often found in trash bags along remote stretches of highway or desert roads, had earned him the moniker, the Trash Bag Killer, and the Freeway Killer, though the latter title would be shared with two other California serial killers operating during the same era. What set Kaerney apart was not just his body count, which would eventually reach at least 21 confirmed victims with possibly twice that number in reality, but the mechanical, almost industrial way he processed his victims, treating their bodies like waste to be efficiently disposed of along California's sprawling highway system. Patrick Wayne Kaerney was born on September 24, 1939, in Los Angeles, California, the eldest of three sons born to George and Eunice Kaerney. From the outside, the Kaerney family appeared typical of post-Depression-era working-class families. The father worked various jobs while the mother maintained the household. But beneath this normal facade, young Patrick was developing in troubling ways that would only become apparent in retrospect. As a child, Kaerney was thin, bookish, and unathletic, traits that made him a target for bullying at school. He was intellectually gifted but socially awkward, preferring to lose himself in books rather than interact with peers. His childhood was marked by isolation and a growing sense of being different from those around him. This difference wasn't just social awkwardness. Kaerney was beginning to recognize his attraction to other males at a time when homosexuality was not just socially unacceptable but illegal in California. The family moved frequently during Patrick's childhood, following his father's work opportunities. This constant upheaval prevented him from forming lasting friendships and deepened his isolation. By his teenage years, Kaerney had developed elaborate violent fantasies that merged sexuality with death. He would later claim these fantasies began around age 13, triggered by a magazine article about President Abraham Lincoln's assassination that described the death throes in graphic detail. After graduating from high school in 1957, Kaerney enlisted in the United States Air Force, perhaps seeking structure and belonging that had eluded him in civilian life. He was stationed at various bases, including a posting to Texas where he worked as a radar technician. The military provided Kaerney with technical training and discipline, but it also exposed him to a hypermasculine environment where his homosexuality had to remain deeply hidden. During his Air Force service, Kaerney began acting on his sexual desires in clandestine encounters, always fearful of discovery which could lead to dishonorable discharge and criminal prosecution. This period of enforced secrecy and shame likely contributed to the fusion of sex and violence in his psyche. He began frequenting areas known for anonymous sexual encounters, learning to compartmentalize his life into public respectability and private deviance. It was also during this period that Kaerney reportedly committed his first murder, though this would not be discovered until years later. The victim was a hitchhiker picked up near El Paso, Texas, sometime in the early 1960s. The murder was impulsive rather than planned, occurring during what started as a consensual encounter. Kaerney would later describe feeling a sense of power and release that he had never experienced before, setting him on a path that would lead to dozens more deaths. After his honorable discharge from the Air Force in 1962, Kaerney returned to California and settled in the Los Angeles area. He used his military training to secure work as an electronics technician at Hughes Aircraft Company, a major defense contractor. To his co-workers, Kaerney appeared to be a quiet, reliable employee who kept to himself but performed his duties competently. He maintained this job for over a decade, providing him with steady income and a veneer of normalcy. In 1965, Kaerney's life took a significant turn when he met David Douglas Hill at a gay bar in Los Angeles. Hill, 5 years younger than Kaerney, was everything Patrick was not: charismatic, attractive, and comfortable with his sexuality. Despite their differences, or perhaps because of them, the two began a relationship that would last over a decade and play a crucial role in Kaerney's killing career. David Douglas Hill came from a background even more troubled than Kaerney's. Born in Lubbock, Texas, in 1944, Hill had experienced significant childhood trauma, including sexual abuse. He had a history of petty crime and had spent time in juvenile facilities. Where Kaerney was methodical and controlled, Hill was impulsive and volatile. Their relationship was turbulent, marked by jealousy, manipulation, and violence. Hill's role in Kaerney's murders remains a subject of debate. While Hill was ultimately convicted as an accomplice in several murders, the extent of his participation varied. In some cases, he appears to have been an active participant, helping to lure victims and dispose of bodies. In others, he may have simply been aware of Kaerney's activities without directly participating. What is clear is that the relationship between the two men created a toxic dynamic that facilitated and perhaps accelerated Kaerney's killing. The couple lived together in various apartments around Los Angeles County, presenting themselves as roommates to maintain appearances. Their home life was characterized by Hill's explosive temper and Kaerney's attempts to maintain control. Hill would often bring home young men for sexual encounters, triggering intense jealousy in Kaerney. These episodes of jealousy often preceded hunting expeditions where Kaerney would cruise for victims. By the late 1960s, Kaerney had developed a consistent pattern for his murders. He would cruise areas known for hitchhikers or male prostitution: Hollywood Boulevard, Selma Avenue, Santa Monica Boulevard, and various freeway on-ramps. He drove a series of unremarkable vehicles, including a Volkswagen Beetle and later a Ford sedan, that wouldn't attract attention. Kaerney's approach was often direct but non-threatening. He would offer rides to young men, particularly those who appeared to be hitchhiking or in need of money. His mild appearance and soft-spoken manner put victims at ease. Once they were in his vehicle, Kaerney would either shoot them immediately with a .22 caliber Derringer pistol he kept hidden beside the driver's seat, or he would take them to a secluded location under the pretense of a sexual encounter. The murder itself was usually quick: a single shot to the head, often to the temple or back of the skull. Kaerney took pride in the efficiency of his kills, later boasting that victims died instantly without suffering. This claim, whether true or self-serving rationalization, speaks to his need to see himself as somehow merciful despite the horror of his crimes. What happened after the murder was what truly set Kaerney apart from other serial killers of his era. He had developed an almost industrial process for disposing of bodies that reflected his technical background and obsessive need for control. After killing a victim, often in his car or garage, Kaerney would transport the body to his home if it wasn't already there. In the garage or bathroom, he would methodically dismember the corpse using hacksaws and other tools. He approached this task with the same technical precision he brought to his work at Hughes Aircraft. The body would be separated into manageable pieces, each wrapped carefully in plastic and then placed in industrial-strength trash bags, the same type used by businesses for waste disposal. Kaerney would then clean the crime scene obsessively, using bleach and other chemicals to remove any trace of blood or other evidence. He took pride in the thoroughness of his cleanup, later claiming that he could completely eliminate all forensic evidence of a murder within hours. The wrapped remains would be stored temporarily, sometimes in a freezer, until he could dispose of them. The disposal itself was carefully planned. Kaerney would drive along remote stretches of freeway, often in the desert areas of Riverside and San Bernardino counties, and pull over as if experiencing car trouble. He would quickly deposit the bags and drive away, the entire process taking less than a minute. He chose different locations each time, making it difficult for authorities to establish a pattern. The early 1970s saw a dramatic escalation in Kaerney's killing. Where he might have previously killed a few times a year, he was now hunting almost monthly. Several factors contributed to this acceleration. His relationship with Hill was deteriorating, marked by increasing violence and jealousy. The gay liberation movement was making the homosexual community more visible, providing more potential victims but also increasing the risk of detection. During this period, Kaerney's victim selection became less discriminating. While he still preferred young men in their late teens or early 20s, he began targeting younger victims, including several boys as young as 12 or 13. These younger victims were often runaways or throwaways, children who had been expelled from their homes for being gay or who had fled abusive situations. They were perfect victims for a predator, vulnerable, unlikely to be immediately missed, and desperate enough to accept help from a stranger. One of his victims during this period was Roland Young, a 17-year-old who disappeared from Hollywood in 1973. Young's dismembered remains were found in trash bags along the Ortega Highway in Riverside County. Another was Michael Craig McGee, just 13 years old, whose body was discovered similarly packaged along a desert road. The youth of these victims added an extra layer of horror to Kaerney's crimes. On March 13, 1977, Kaerney picked up 17-year-old John Otis LeMay in Orange County. LeMay, who had been visiting friends, accepted a ride from the soft-spoken older man. Kaerney shot him almost immediately after he entered the car, then transported the body to his garage for dismemberment. However, this murder would prove different from the others. LeMay came from a stable family who immediately reported him missing and pushed for an intensive investigation. Additionally, witnesses had seen LeMay getting into a vehicle matching the description of Kaerney's car. For the first time, police had solid leads connecting the trash bag discoveries to a specific suspect vehicle. The discovery of LeMay's remains in trash bags along the Riverside Freeway, combined with the witness descriptions, led police to begin surveillance of similar vehicles in areas where victims had been picked up. The net was beginning to close around Kaerney, though he didn't yet know it. By 1976, Kaerney's relationship with David Hill had reached a breaking point. Hill had begun a relationship with another man and moved out of their shared home. This abandonment triggered a psychological crisis in Kaerney. He had always been possessive and controlling, but Hill's departure removed whatever restraints had been keeping his violence in check. In the months following Hill's departure, Kaerney's killing accelerated dramatically. He was no longer even attempting to maintain periods of cooling off between murders. He would sometimes kill multiple victims in a single week, barely taking time to properly dispose of one body before hunting for the next. This recklessness, born of emotional turmoil, would ultimately contribute to his capture. Hill, meanwhile, had his own troubles. His new relationship was marked by violence and drug use. He had begun talking about his years with Kaerney, making vague references to terrible things he had witnessed. These comments, made to drinking companions and casual acquaintances, would eventually reach the ears of law enforcement. By early 1977, law enforcement agencies across Southern California were beginning to recognize patterns in the trash bag body discoveries. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, working with police departments in Riverside, San Bernardino, and Orange counties, formed a task force to investigate what they believed was the work of a serial killer. The task force faced enormous challenges. The victims were scattered across multiple jurisdictions, many remained unidentified, and the killer's body disposal method had eliminated most forensic evidence. The fact that many victims were gay men or boys who had been estranged from their families meant that missing persons reports were often filed late or not at all. Detectives began mapping the locations where bodies had been found, looking for patterns. They noticed that many disposal sites were along specific stretches of highway that could be accessed from the Los Angeles area within a few hours' drive. They also noted that the dismemberment showed a consistent methodology, suggesting someone with technical skill and access to tools. The task force brought in criminal psychologists to develop a profile of the killer. Based on the evidence, they theorized that the perpetrator was likely a white male in his 30s or 40s, probably homosexual or bisexual, with technical or mechanical skills. The methodical nature of the body disposal suggested someone with obsessive-compulsive tendencies and above-average intelligence. The profilers also noted that the killer likely lived in the Los Angeles area and had reliable transportation and a private space where he could dismember bodies without detection. The fact that he had operated for so long without being caught suggested he was socially functional, possibly employed, and able to blend into society. This profile, while generally accurate, described thousands of men in the Los Angeles area. Without more specific evidence, it was of limited use in narrowing down suspects. What investigators needed was a break, a witness, a surviving victim, or a mistake by the killer. The break came from an unexpected source. In early 1977, David Hill was arrested on unrelated charges in Texas. During questioning, he made references to murders in California, suggesting he had knowledge of the trash bag killings. Texas authorities contacted the California task force, who immediately flew to Texas to interview Hill. Hill's initial statements were vague and self-serving. He admitted to being present during some murders but claimed he was forced to participate by Kaerney, whom he portrayed as a violent, controlling psychopath. He provided enough details about the murders to convince investigators he had genuine knowledge, but he was careful to minimize his own involvement. Investigators were skeptical of Hill's claims of being merely a frightened accomplice, but they recognized that he could lead them to the primary killer. Hill agreed to cooperate in exchange for consideration in his own case, though prosecutors made no firm promises about leniency. With Hill's information, the task force now had a primary suspect, Patrick Wayne Kaerney. They began surveillance of Kaerney's residence in Redondo Beach, where he had moved after separating from Hill. Investigators noted that Kaerney maintained regular habits, going to work at Hughes Aircraft, returning home, occasionally visiting gay bars on weekends. Search warrant affidavits were prepared based on Hill's statements, but prosecutors wanted more evidence before moving against Kaerney. They feared that without physical evidence or additional witnesses, the case might rely too heavily on Hill's testimony, which could be challenged given his own criminal involvement. Meanwhile, investigators began re-examining old missing persons cases, looking for connections to Kaerney. They discovered that several young men who had disappeared from areas Kaerney was known to frequent had never been found. The true scope of his crimes was beginning to become apparent. On July 1, 1977, investigators received information that Kaerney was exhibiting signs of preparing to flee. He had been seen purchasing camping equipment and had withdrawn a large sum of money from his bank account. The task force decided they could wait no longer. However, when police arrived at Kaerney's residence, they discovered he had already left. A bulletin was issued for his arrest, and his photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the western United States. The media was alerted, and Kaerney's face appeared on television news broadcasts and in newspapers. Kaerney, who had been monitoring news coverage of the investigation, realized that capture was inevitable. He had indeed been planning to flee, possibly to Mexico, but the rapid law enforcement response had cut off his escape routes. He was now a hunted man with nowhere to run. On July 1, 1977, in a move that surprised investigators, Patrick Kaerney walked into the Riverside County Sheriff's Office and surrendered. He was accompanied by his attorney, demonstrating that he had been planning this surrender and seeking to control the narrative of his capture. He appeared calm and composed, dressed in casual clothes as if arriving for a business meeting rather than to confess to multiple murders. Kaerney's decision to surrender was calculated. He knew that Hill had been talking to police and that evidence was mounting against him. By turning himself in, he hoped to maintain some control over the situation and possibly negotiate a plea deal that would spare him from the death penalty, which had been reinstated in California just a few years earlier. During his initial interrogation, Kaerney was cooperative but selective in his admissions. He confessed to the murders that Hill had already told police about but remained silent about others. He was polite, articulate, and showed no emotion when describing the killings. Investigators were struck by his matter-of-fact demeanor, as if he were describing routine tasks rather than brutal murders. Over the following weeks, Kaerney began to reveal the true extent of his crimes. Perhaps recognizing that full cooperation was his only chance to avoid the death penalty, or perhaps driven by a narcissistic need to have his work acknowledged, he began confessing to murders that police hadn't even connected to him. He provided detailed accounts of each killing, including dates, locations, victim descriptions, and disposal sites. His memory was remarkably precise. He could recall specific details about victims' clothing, the weather on the day of the murder, and exact locations where he had disposed of remains. This level of detail both horrified and fascinated investigators. Kaerney confessed to 28 murders in total, though he hinted that the actual number might be higher. He claimed that some early victims from the 1960s were never found and that he had perfected his disposal method to the point where some bodies would never be discovered. Investigators believed him. Vast stretches of California desert held secrets that might never be revealed. When pressed about his motivations, Kaerney provided various explanations that seemed more like intellectualizations than genuine insight. He claimed that he killed to possess his victims completely, that death was the ultimate form of control. He spoke of the sexual excitement he derived from the act of killing, describing it as more intense than any other experience. He also revealed the ritual aspects of his crimes. After killing a victim, he would often engage in necrophilia, something he had initially denied. He would photograph some victims and keep personal items as trophies. The dismemberment itself had become ritualized, following the same pattern each time, providing him with a sense of order and control. Kaerney showed no remorse for his crimes, though he occasionally expressed a clinical regret that his actions had been necessary. He seemed to view his murders as a condition he had to manage rather than choices he had made. This lack of emotional connection to his crimes disturbed even experienced investigators who had dealt with other serial killers. Facing overwhelming evidence and his own confessions, Kaerney's legal team focused on avoiding the death penalty. California had reinstated capital punishment in 1976, and Kaerney's crimes certainly warranted consideration for execution. However, prosecutors faced their own challenges. The cases were spread across multiple jurisdictions, many bodies had never been recovered, and some of the evidence was circumstantial. In December 1977, a plea agreement was reached. Kaerney would plead guilty to 21 murders and receive 21 concurrent life sentences. In exchange, he would avoid the death penalty and provide full cooperation in closing unsolved cases. The deal was controversial. Many felt that Kaerney deserved death for his crimes, but prosecutors argued that it provided closure for families and avoided lengthy, traumatic trials. The plea agreement required Kaerney to provide detailed confessions for each murder, assist in locating remains that hadn't been recovered, and testify against David Hill if necessary. Kaerney fulfilled these requirements with the same methodical precision he had brought to his murders. On September 21, 1978, Patrick Kaerney stood before Superior Court Judge John Hughes to receive his sentence. The courtroom was packed with victims' family members, investigators who had worked the case, and media representatives. Kaerney, dressed in a suit and appearing every inch the mild-mannered technician he had pretended to be, showed no emotion as the judge read the verdicts. Judge Hughes, before imposing sentence, made a statement about the heinous nature of the crimes. He noted that Kaerney had shown a callous disregard for human life, and had preyed upon the vulnerable and defenseless. He acknowledged the plea agreement but made clear that Kaerney would never again walk free. Kaerney was sentenced to 21 concurrent terms of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole. However, given the nature of his crimes and the number of victims, everyone understood that parole would never be granted. Kaerney would die in prison, whether by old age or violence from other inmates who particularly despised child killers. David Hill was tried separately for 3 murders in which prosecutors could prove his direct involvement. His defense team argued that he had been under Kaerney's control, a victim of psychological manipulation who had been forced to participate in the murders. They portrayed him as a battered partner who had been too terrified to leave or report Kaerney's crimes. The prosecution painted a different picture, showing Hill as a willing participant who had helped lure victims and dispose of bodies. They presented evidence that Hill had been present during multiple murders and had never attempted to help victims or alert authorities. His claims of being a helpless victim were undermined by witnesses who testified about his violent temper and manipulative behavior. In 1978, Hill was convicted of 1 count of murder and 2 counts of manslaughter. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. The different verdicts reflected the jury's uncertainty about his level of involvement in each crime. Hill would serve several decades before being paroled, a decision that outraged victims' families who felt he should have died in prison alongside Kaerney. Forensic psychologists who examined Kaerney diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder and sexual sadism disorder. His crimes showed the hallmarks of an organized serial killer: careful planning, victim selection, and sophisticated disposal methods. Yet there were also elements of disorganization, particularly in his later murders when emotional stress led to increased risk-taking. Kaerney's sexuality and its relationship to his violence became a subject of intense study. Unlike many serial killers who target victims as surrogates for people who had wronged them, Kaerney seemed to kill those he was attracted to. The fusion of sex and death in his psyche appeared to be complete. He could not experience one without the other. His obsessive-compulsive tendencies were evident not just in his killing ritual but in all aspects of his life. Co-workers described him as meticulous to the point of annoyance, someone who would spend hours organizing already organized materials. This need for control extended to his murders, where he controlled every aspect from selection to disposal. The relationship between Kaerney and Hill provided insights into how serial killer partnerships function. While Kaerney was clearly the dominant partner and primary killer, Hill's presence served multiple functions. He provided emotional support and validation, helped normalize the violence through participation, and served as an audience for Kaerney's crimes. Some analysts compared their relationship to other killer couples, noting patterns of codependency and shared psychopathology. The fact that Kaerney's killing escalated dramatically after Hill's departure suggested that Hill had served as both catalyst and restraint, encouraging the violence while also providing enough emotional stability to prevent complete decompensation. Kaerney's crimes occurred during a period of significant social change in the gay community. The Stonewall riots of 1969 had sparked the gay liberation movement, leading to increased visibility and activism. However, this period also saw a backlash and continued discrimination. Many gay men still lived partially closeted lives, making them vulnerable to predators like Kaerney. The fact that many of Kaerney's victims were gay or questioning youth who had been rejected by their families highlighted the vulnerabilities created by homophobia. These young men, desperate for acceptance and often engaging in survival sex work, were perfect targets for a predator. Their marginalized status meant their disappearances often went uninvestigated. The investigation into Kaerney's crimes also revealed problematic attitudes within law enforcement. Many officers admitted they had not taken the disappearances of gay men as seriously as they would have other missing persons cases. This institutional bias had allowed Kaerney to operate longer than he might have otherwise. For the families of Kaerney's victims, his capture and conviction brought a complex mix of relief and renewed grief. Many had spent years not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. Learning the truth, that their sons, brothers, and friends had been murdered and dismembered, was devastating. Some families had to confront difficult truths about their missing relatives. Parents who hadn't known their sons were gay or who had rejected them for their sexuality faced additional layers of guilt and regret. Support groups formed to help families process their grief and guilt, bringing together people who shared the unique trauma of losing someone to a serial killer. The families of unidentified victims faced particular anguish. Kaerney had described victims that matched missing persons reports, but without bodies or definitive identification, families were left in limbo. Some chose to believe their loved ones were among Kaerney's victims to achieve closure, while others continued hoping for different answers. The Kaerney case led to significant changes in how California law enforcement agencies handled missing persons cases and serial crimes. Better communication protocols were established between jurisdictions, recognizing that serial killers often operated across county lines. The case also highlighted the need for centralized databases to track similar crimes across jurisdictions. Training programs were developed to help officers recognize potential serial crimes and overcome biases that might prevent them from taking certain disappearances seriously. The marginalized status of many of Kaerney's victims became a teaching point about the importance of treating all missing persons cases with equal urgency. The case also contributed to the development of criminal profiling techniques. The accuracy of the profile developed during the investigation validated the usefulness of psychological analysis in serial crime investigations. The differences between the profile and Kaerney's actual characteristics also provided valuable lessons about the limitations of profiling. Patrick Kaerney was initially housed at California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo before being transferred to Mule Creek State Prison. He adapted to prison life with the same methodical approach he had brought to his crimes. He worked in the prison library, took educational courses, and maintained a routine that provided structure to his days. Kaerney rarely gave interviews and showed no interest in the notoriety that some serial killers seek. He corresponded with a small number of people interested in his case, including criminologists and true crime writers, but these communications were typically brief and unrevealing. He seemed content to fade into obscurity within the prison system. Other inmates largely left Kaerney alone, perhaps recognizing the danger in antagonizing someone capable of such extreme violence. He aged quietly in prison, his once dark hair turning white, his body growing frail. Yet prison officials noted that he never showed any sign of remorse or emotional disturbance about his crimes. Despite Kaerney's confessions and conviction, many questions about his crimes remain unanswered. The true number of his victims will likely never be known. Kaerney himself claimed uncertainty about the exact count, suggesting that some early murders had blurred together in his memory. Investigators believe the number could be as high as 43, making him one of America's most prolific serial killers. The extent of David Hill's involvement also remains debated. While he was convicted as an accomplice, some investigators believe he was more active in the murders than ever proven. Others maintain that he was primarily a witness whose presence enabled Kaerney's crimes but who rarely participated directly. Hill's parole and subsequent disappearance from public view left these questions unresolved. There are also questions about missed opportunities to catch Kaerney earlier. Reviews of the case revealed that he had been questioned by police at least twice during the 1970s in connection with missing persons cases but had been released due to lack of evidence. Whether more thorough investigations might have prevented later murders remains a source of debate and regret. Kaerney was one of 3 serial killers operating in Southern California during the 1970s who became known as freeway killers. The others were William Bonin and Randy Kraft, who also targeted young men and used the freeway system to hunt and dispose of victims. This concentration of similar predators in the same geographic area and time period has been the subject of extensive study. Some researchers have suggested that Southern California's car culture, extensive freeway system, and transient population created ideal conditions for serial killers. The anonymity of freeway travel, the ease of picking up hitchhikers, and the vast empty spaces for body disposal all contributed to making the region a hunting ground for predators. The simultaneous operation of 3 similar killers also complicated investigations. Bodies that might have been attributed to one killer were actually the work of another. Patterns that might have emerged more clearly were obscured by the overlapping activities. It wasn't until years later that investigators fully understood how these different killers' activities had intersected and confused the investigation. The Kaerney case, along with the other freeway killer cases, had a profound impact on Southern California culture. Hitchhiking, once a common practice, virtually disappeared. Parents became more protective of their children, particularly teenage boys who had previously been considered less vulnerable than girls. The gay community, already dealing with discrimination and the emerging AIDS crisis, faced additional fears about predators within their own community. The case also influenced popular culture, inspiring numerous books, documentaries, and fictional works. The image of the highway as a dangerous place where predators hunted became embedded in the American consciousness. The term, freeway killer, entered the lexicon as a shorthand for a particular type of predator who used mobility and anonymity to avoid capture. As of 2024, Patrick Kaerney remains alive in California's prison system, now in his 80s. He has been denied parole multiple times and will certainly die in prison. Yet his case continues to serve as a warning about the dangers that can hide behind ordinary appearances. Kaerney's ability to maintain a normal life while committing horrific crimes, holding a steady job, maintaining relationships, functioning in society, demonstrates how serial killers can hide in plain sight. His technical profession and mild manner made him an unlikely suspect, reminding us that predators don't always match our stereotypical expectations. The vulnerability of his victims, young men who were marginalized by poverty, sexuality, or family rejection, remains relevant today. While society has become more accepting of LGBTQ+ individuals, young people fleeing hostile families or struggling with their identity remain vulnerable to predators who promise acceptance and understanding. Today, drivers speeding along Southern California's freeways give little thought to the dark history of these roads. The specific locations where Kaerney disposed of his victims have been developed or altered by decades of construction. The desert spots where trash bags containing human remains were found show no sign of their grim past. Yet for those who remember the case, every piece of roadside litter carries a shadow of menace. The industrial trash bags that Kaerney used as coffins were identical to thousands used legitimately every day. This banality of evil, the use of everyday objects for horrific purposes, remains one of the most disturbing aspects of his crimes. Patrick Wayne Kaerney transformed California's symbol of freedom and mobility, its freeway system, into a hunting ground and cemetery. He turned the routine act of accepting a ride into a potentially fatal decision. His crimes exploited the very openness and trust that characterized the era, helping to end the innocence of the 1970s and usher in a more suspicious, fearful time. The victims of Patrick Kaerney were more than statistics or case numbers. They were young men with hopes and dreams, many of whom had already faced rejection and hardship before encountering their killer. John LeMay had been planning to join the military. Michael McGee had been trying to reconnect with his family. Ronald Smith was just beginning to explore his identity. Each represented a life cut short, potential unrealized, and families left with permanent wounds. The investigation and capture of Kaerney represented both a triumph of law enforcement and a failure of the system. While investigators eventually stopped his killing spree and brought him to justice, the years he operated freely and the victims who might have been saved had earlier opportunities not been missed serve as reminders of the importance of taking all missing persons seriously, regardless of their background or lifestyle. The communities most affected by Kaerney's crimes, the LGBTQ+ community, immigrant families, and those living on society's margins, continue to grapple with the legacy of his violence. Trust, once shattered, is difficult to rebuild. The knowledge that someone who appeared so ordinary could harbor such evil has left permanent psychological scars on those who lived through the era of the freeway killer. For the families of victims, the pain never truly ends. Every birthday, holiday, and anniversary brings renewed grief for lives cut short. Some families have channeled their pain into advocacy, working to ensure better treatment of missing persons cases and support for victims' families. Others have retreated into private grief, unable to find meaning in such senseless loss. David Hill, released on parole after serving his sentence, disappeared into obscurity. His role in the murders and his life after prison remain subjects of speculation. Some believe he got away with murder, literally, by portraying himself as Kaerney's victim rather than his accomplice. Others see him as another casualty of Kaerney's evil influence, someone whose life was derailed by involvement with a psychopath. The Patrick Kaerney case offers numerous lessons for modern law enforcement and society. The importance of interagency cooperation, the dangers of bias in investigating crimes against marginalized communities, and the need for comprehensive databases to track serial crimes all emerged from the failures and eventual successes of this investigation. The case also demonstrates the importance of listening to communities when they report patterns of violence. The gay community had suspected a serial killer was operating long before police took their concerns seriously. Had these warnings been heeded earlier, lives might have been saved. This lesson remains relevant today as communities continue to face violence that authorities sometimes dismiss or minimize. For criminal psychologists and profilers, Kaerney represents a particular type of organized killer whose ordinary exterior masked extraordinary evil. His ability to compartmentalize his life, maintaining employment and relationships while committing serial murder, challenges assumptions about what serial killers look like and how they behave. He wasn't a drifter or obviously disturbed individual but someone who could have been anyone's coworker or neighbor. Looking back at Kaerney's progression from his first impulsive murder to his methodical killing spree reveals the evolution of a serial killer. Each murder made the next easier, each successful body disposal emboldened him to continue. The years of getting away with murder convinced him of his superiority and invulnerability. This gradual escalation, from fantasy to action, from impulsive to organized, from occasional to frequent, follows patterns seen in many serial killers but rarely documented so thoroughly. Kaerney's case also illustrates how serial killers adapt and learn. His early murders were riskier, the body disposal less sophisticated. Over time, he refined his methods, learned from near misses, and developed a system that allowed him to kill for so long without detection. This adaptive capacity makes serial killers particularly dangerous and difficult to catch. Perhaps most disturbingly, Kaerney himself had warned society about people like him. In one of his few extended interviews, he stated that there were others like him operating undetected, that the conditions that created him, childhood trauma, sexual confusion, social isolation, were creating others. He suggested that for every serial killer caught, several more operated in the shadows. While Kaerney's pronouncements must be viewed skeptically, serial killers often inflate their importance and insights. Subsequent events have proven him partially correct. Other serial killers have emerged using similar methods, targeting similar victims, exploiting the same vulnerabilities in society's safety net. The trash bag killer methodology has been replicated by other killers, suggesting that Kaerney's crimes served as a template for those who followed. In the final accounting, Patrick Wayne Kaerney murdered at least 21 young men and boys, possibly twice that number. He destroyed dozens of families, traumatized communities, and left a legacy of fear that persists decades later. His crimes revealed failures in law enforcement, social services, and society's treatment of marginalized individuals. Yet his capture and conviction also demonstrated that even the most careful killers can be caught, that justice, however delayed, can be achieved. Kaerney remains in California's prison system, an elderly man who will never again walk free. He has outlived many of his victims' parents, investigators who worked his case, and journalists who covered his crimes. In his old age, he has become a footnote in criminal history, overshadowed by more recent and sensational cases. Yet for those who remember, he remains a symbol of the evil that can hide behind an ordinary face. The highways of Southern California continue to carry millions of drivers each day, most unaware of the dark history beneath their wheels. The desert continues to hide secrets, some of which may never be discovered. And somewhere in the vast American landscape, other predators likely continue Kaerney's legacy, hunting the vulnerable, exploiting the marginalized, and counting on society's indifference to protect them. The story of Patrick Wayne Kaerney is ultimately a cautionary tale about the dangers of dehumanization. By viewing his victims as objects to be possessed and discarded, literally treating them as trash, Kaerney embodied the ultimate expression of human evil. His crimes remind us that every missing person matters, that every life has value, and that society's failure to protect its most vulnerable members enables predators to flourish. As we move forward, the lessons learned from the Kaerney case must not be forgotten. The young men he murdered deserve to be remembered not just as victims but as individuals whose lives mattered. Their deaths, while tragic and senseless, have led to improvements in law enforcement, greater awareness of predatory behavior, and increased support for vulnerable communities. In this small way, their legacy lives on, a testament to the value of lives cut tragically short by one of America's most prolific serial killers. The trash bags along the highway are gone, the physical evidence of Kaerney's crimes long since processed and filed away. But the impact of his actions continues to ripple through time, affecting families, communities, and systems in ways both obvious and subtle. Patrick Wayne Kaerney, the trash bag killer, stands as a reminder that evil often comes not with horns and fangs but with a mild manner and a helpful smile, and that vigilance against such evil must never cease.